Amanda here. It's been a while, eh? I appreciate those of you who have messaged me on Instagram and been like,
hey, are you gonna upload a video soon?
So here is my attempt at trying to get back into making videos. So today I thought I would just make a quick, well, I say quick, it's gonna be like 20 minutes of me rambling, but I'm going to attempt to make a video of just my favorite books that I have read this past year. I haven't read as many as I hoped that I would. Yeah, you know, that's life, but we're gonna roll with it, and hopefully this year I can read a bit more and hit my goal. Look at who came to say hello. It's Marella. It's a mixture of books. I don't know why I feel the need to say that. You guys by now should know that my taste is pretty all over the place. So it's not all horror, it's not all one particular genre, it's just the books that really moved me this year and changed my life, if I'm not being a little dramatic. Maybe that's a little dramatic, but did affect me in a way that other books hadn't. So let's get into it. Are you ready? Are you guys ready? Okay, let's start. Why is my cat being so sweet right now? You're never sweet. It means she's trying to summon Satan later or something. Hail Satan! So first we're gonna start, I'm gonna go backwards. So I'm gonna save my favorite book that I read for last. So let's start with the first book that I loved this year. This was one that I had actually read recently. It's called We Have Always Lived in This Castle, and it's by Shirley Jackson. This was actually made into a novel, and I believe it's still on Netflix. No, film. Come on. This was made into a film. I believe it was in 2018. Okay, so this is quite an old book. It is actually the first Shirley Jackson novel I have read. I did read this novel and watch the movie, and in fact I was going to do a whole video comparing the two, but I don't like talking. If I have nothing good to say, I don't like talking about something because you know, it's somebody's art and somebody spent a lot of time and effort, but I don't like criticizing somebody else's form of art, regardless of whether that's, you know, literature or film or music or whatever it is, because I know that, you know, especially as a writer, that it takes a lot of hard work. So I didn't love the film, but let me explain why. Because it's not just like, oh, this film sucked. I think it was an entertaining film and it was cool seeing the characters brought to life. That being said, the reason why I loved this novel so much was because of how dark and dismal it is. I mean, from the very opening sentence to the very last sentence, one of the best parts about this novel is you're not really told the full story, so there's a lot of interpretation in it, there's a lot of questions that are arisen that aren't necessarily answered. So sometimes books like that I think are so interesting, where I feel like I say interesting to describe everything, whatever, where you start with you know, a few questions, and then as the book finishes, you're left with more questions than answers. That's definitely how I felt reading this book. The movie tried to give you answers. It tried to kind of fill in the blanks for you, and that was kind of the special part of reading this novel for me, was not having that filled in. So I feel like the movie kind of did a disservice in that sense, as well as the movie was very bright and beautiful, and it just didn't match the overall feeling of the book that I had when I read it. Obviously everybody has their own interpretations and feelings when they read a novel, so perhaps that was, you know, the director's or the writer's idea when they read the story. But to me, it's just a very dark story, you know. It's about, I didn't even tell you what it's about. Oh my gosh. It's about this brother, sister, and uncle that live together, and you find out that the rest of their family was poisoned while they had dinner, and the older sister was actually taken to court, but she was acquitted of the murder. Again, you do get some answers, but I feel like a lot of questions remain. It remains pretty dark throughout. So this was one of my favorite books that I read this year. I highly suggest that you read it if you haven't yet. And I will definitely be dabbling more into Shirley Jackson because she just killed it. The writing style, everything. I loved the whole tone of this novel. Fantastic. So there's that one. So second on my list, we have Misery by Stephen King. I had of course seen Misery before and of course read other Stephen King novels, but this was the first time this year that I had read Misery. And I don't think I have to give too much of a synopsis. I think most of us know what happens in the story. There's a writer named Paul. He gets into a car accident, and this woman named Annie Wilkes kind of stumbles upon him. He's her favorite writer. She holds him hostage, and it's like his fight for survival. It gets pretty descriptive and pretty intense. I don't want to say one of Stephen King's few novels that you're grounded in reality the whole time, but it's not, you know, it's not supernatural. You don't have to use your imagination too much. It's a very realistic type of story, and sometimes those types of stories are more terrifying than using your imagination and thinking of the supernatural. Oh, another funny thing, I gotta tell you this. So I had the amazing experience of being able to go and see Stephen King talk about his book. I think it was Finders Keepers, but it could have been End of Watch. So we drove all the way to New Mexico just to hear him talk, and it was him and the writer of, what is that show called that everyone's obsessed with the dragons and shit? Anyways, I've never seen the show, so I don't know. But I believe it was the author that wrote the novels that show was based upon. Okay, you know what? I'm just gonna find his name because it's gonna bug me. What do I even Google? Like that show about dragons? Actually. Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. So J.R.R. Martin and Stephen King are kind of interviewing each other as a way of Stephen King to promote one of his books. So George R.R. Martin tells a story that he said the scariest thing that a fan has ever done was sent a box to his house, not his P.O. box, but to his actual address. There was no return label, no name of who had sent it, and the only item inside was Misery by Stephen King. Isn't that just the best story ever? Okay, so for number 3, we have The Stranger. So this is by, and please pardon my horrible pronunciation, Albert Camus? He's French, okay? He's a French novelist, he's an essayist. Some would argue he's a philosopher, but I did read that during his time he didn't quite consider himself a philosopher. He also won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, which is amazing, and I know why, because this book is fantastic. Again, excuse my poor pronunciation, but the main character in this story, his name is Marcel, and the thing that I found most interesting about this story is you're pretty much just following this man around. First you learn that his mother has passed away. Now there's a really popular line in the novel and it says, "Mother died today," or maybe it was yesterday. I don't know. Kind of right from the beginning you get this sense that he is kind of void of emotion. He goes to his mother's funeral and you know, she's an older woman, so I believe she lived at like a kind of like a nursing home, so there were people crying and, you know, talking about how great she was, and her own son is just kind of sitting there unfazed by the events. Then you follow throughout his path. He mingles with unsavory characters, gets into a bit of a debacle where he ends up murdering a man. So he's put on trial, and kind of the whole time he's really unfazed by the events. He kind of just assumes that he will get his freedom eventually, and he's found guilty and is going to be hanged, I believe. Or is he guillotined? Regardless of the method, he will be put to death. He kind of just accepts his fate. The interesting thing is that while I'm reading it, so I start with the story and I feel immediately distanced from this character. I want to keep him, the narrator, at arm's length. I don't really trust him. He seems a bit like a sociopath. He's very void of emotion. He's very expressionless. Well, I guess I should start by saying that Albert, the author, he has himself, it seems like, very nihilistic views, where he kind of talks about, you know, accepting the lack of meaning in one's life, and by doing that you can rebel and, you know, appreciate what you have, kind of. So it's not necessarily a negative thing, but at the end of the day he's like, life kind of has no meaning, and this main character definitely has that same idea, that same perspective, where kind of like life is meaningless. You just gotta accept it and move on. And the interesting thing is that as you move on and as you follow this main character through his journey, through, you know, essentially the end of his short life, I started to feel closer and closer to this narrative, where I started almost being like, oh shit, the reason why I held him at such a distance is because I don't want that to be true. But is it? Eventually we're all going to have to face the fact that we all will meet our demise and the world will still continue, and that's kind of it. You're kind of faced with your own mortality. Yeah, at least me, I started out kind of resenting this narrator, and at the end I kind of started sympathizing with him. It is just a really interesting, very nihilistic viewpoint, and just a beautifully written story. It's 123 pages. Fantastic novel. I highly, highly, highly suggest that you read that one. Second to last, SlaughterhouseFive by Kurt Vonnegut. So SlaughterhouseFive is such a trippy book. So you start out with a narrator who we kind of assume is Kurt, and he's talking about, he wanted to write a book about war because he saw the bombing in Dresden in Germany, and it affected him, obviously. He felt like he needed to write the book, but he was also nervous. And then it goes into kind of this fictional story, although not fictional. It seems autobiographical in the sense that it's kind of talking about, obviously, the war that Kurt went through, and supposedly the main character that we follow, Billy Pilgrim, I believe his name is, it is based on somebody that he actually was in the war with, if I'm not mistaken. This book is crazy because it's kind of like a mix of science fiction and then kind of like autobiographical, but then kind of like fiction, and it's just all over the place. So it follows this man named Billy Pilgrim. By the way, this is definitely like an anti-war book. It in no way glorifies war. Also, it doesn't talk about, heroes in war. It doesn't talk about leaders in war. It talks about people that are ground zeros, soldiers, people that are taken hostage. Also not a linear path. We're all over the place. We're present, we're future, we're past, we're all jumbled. It follows Billy Pilgrim. It talks about his childhood. It talks about him being sent to the war. It talks about how he's captured by the enemy in war. It talks about how he escapes. It talks about his life after becoming an optometrist. And then it talks about how he survived an airplane crash, and afterwards, he's the only person that survives. He goes through, obviously, such a traumatic life with, witnessing war at such a young age. And then he grows up and he gets in a plane crash with his family members, and all of them die, a ton of them die, and then his wife ends up dying. So it's him and his children, obviously very traumatic, and he starts talking about how he was abducted by aliens, which is where kind of like the science fiction kicks in. But it's interesting because, is this, a metaphor for the war that he's been in, being captured? Is this a side effect of the plane crash that he had been through? It's just a really interesting story. Not only that, but the way that it's written and the way that it all comes full circle, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful story. Highly recommend, as I do with all of these. Okay, number 5. Again, I apologize for my pronunciation. This is an Italian writer, Dante Alighieri? Dante, okay? This is part of Dante's Divine Comedy. Okay, so the Divine Comedy, it's an epic poem, and it's broken into 3 different parts. So we have Dante's Inferno, we have Dante's, what comes after Inferno? Paradise? Purgatory. Dante's Inferno, Purgatory, and then Paradise. I'm just specifically talking about Inferno today because, wow, this book is fantastic. I cannot tell you how much I loved reading this story. It's an epic poem. It's an allegory. It's, there's a lot of pieces that can be taken off and analyzed, and I could probably make a whole other video by itself on this. But what I'm just focusing on today, because this is a horror channel, and I know you creeps love your horror, we're just talking about horror. So this book, let me tell you, okay, the reason that I love Greek mythology specifically and classical literature is because it is so dark. This obviously isn't Greek, but it does base a lot around Greek mythology. Anything that kind of pulls from those stories, the same thing. They're so dark. They're darker than anything that is written nowadays, and I promise you that. They are the most messed up stories that you will ever read. So Dante's Inferno did not disappoint. Okay, so basically what happens is Dante is led down through the 9 rings of hell by Virgil, which is his guide. Okay, so this is an epic poem. An epic poem is essentially just like a very long poem that's written. It generally has a hero that it follows through their journey, but there are obviously plenty of epic poems. Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, John Milton's Paradise Lost. Just like fantastic stories of journeying to foreign places and seeing magical things. Dante's Guide Through Hell is Virgil, based off of Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, if I'm not mistaken. But the reason this is so fantastic is because it leads you down these 7 rings of hell and you get an idea of why each person's there. And mind you, it's not like, oh, he murdered someone. It's like, oh, he lied once and now he's burning in an eternal flame. Like, it's pretty harsh. But let me just read you a few excerpts that I've highlighted. So for example, this is just one line in the story. You will see the river of blood that boils the souls of those with who their violence injured others. Be quiet, cursed wolf of hell. Feed on the burning bile that rots your guts. So I'm telling you, this is one of the most twisted stories that you will ever read. Yeah, so you just get to see basically these tormented souls, these 7 rings of hell, and as you go closer to the center of hell, things get more intense. You know, there's demons everywhere. There's people from Greek and Roman mythology that he kind of comes across. It talks about why each person is at this level. It is dark, it is twisted, it is gory. So if you love things like that, I promise you, you will love Dante's Inferno. Again, not talking about the whole Divine Comedy, and by the way, it's a comedy just because it ends happily instead of tragically. It's not like, haha, comedy. A fantastic, fantastic story, if nothing else. You know, I mean, obviously it's amazing if you want to look into the allegory and the themes and analyze it further. Brilliant for that as well, but just as like a basis story, it's dark and twisted. Okay, so those are my 5 favorite books that I read last year. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I still need to figure out an outro because I'm so awkward. Okay, bye!